afternoon or good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, during which we are going to talk about a key topic for the coming years, but also for the green transition that is very much needed. I'm Delphine Adenau-Ousu, the Executive Director of the EU Chamber of Commerce in Canada, UCAN. Co-founded by the EU Commission, UCAN advocates on behalf of companies wanting to do business on both sides of the Atlantic. We also promote CETA agreements and business relations between the EU and Canada. In 2021, the EU and Canada announced a strategic partnership on critical raw materials. I'm not the expert here, but with this great panel, we will explore the challenges that this strategic partnership is meant to address, how it could materialize, but also the implication for businesses in the green transition. This event is possible thanks to the support of Global Affairs Canada, Affaires Mondiales Canada. Before I give her the floor, I would like to introduce our moderator of the day, Dr. Sofia Kalamtzakos. She's a global distinguished professor in environmental studies and public policy at New York University and NYU Abu Dhabi. Two of her most recent books include China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earth, published by Oxford University Press, and The EU, US, and China, Tackling Climate Change, Policies and Alliance for the Anthropocene. A main body of her work examines how the strategic value of mineral deposits for the decarbonization of the global economy and the fourth industrial revolution intersects with a changing post-carbon resource map, accelerating geopolitical realignments between the developing and the developed worlds. To our panelists and moderator today, I wanted to warmly thank you on behalf of UCAN, and to our participants, I hope you enjoy the discussion and learn as much as I did during our prep call. You will have the opportunity to ask all your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at the end of the panel. Over to you, Sofia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to moderate such a wonderful panel of speakers. And greetings, everyone, and welcome to what I know will be a fascinating discussion. A warm thank you to the organizers and to the participants. Now, what gave impetus to this gathering is the fact that the European Union and Canada signed a strategic partnership in raw materials in June of 2021. It couldn't have come at a better time, although I should really ask what took so long. After all, the decarbonization drive is no longer in question, and countries are pledging to reach net zero by mid-century. So what did the EU and Canada agree to? They said that they would like to advance trade and investments into a secure, sustainable, and resilient raw materials value chain. Canada and the European Union will focus on enhancing collaboration in science, technology, and innovation, all key areas to decarbonize and digitalize their economies. They're also looking to work together on the development of ESG criteria and standards. The two parties seek to align financial support for critical mineral projects, to leverage and de-risk private investments, and also to innovate in finding ways to mine critical raw materials from wastewaters. These are both noble and important intentions, but it is also crucial to spotlight why this kind of strategic partnership became necessary at this stage. It's not only because of accelerated global decarbonization and digitalization efforts. It's because two seismic economic and technological shifts are also taking place in a climate of extremely fraught geopolitics, centering around China's growing power, and for the purpose of our conversation, because of the PRC's clear supply chain dominance for materials and applications vital to this transition. Both Europe and Canada thus seek to build resilience and diversify supply chains in line with their updated industrial strategies. Today, we have a distinguished panel of speakers who will give us much needed insight about what this strategic partnership means in practical terms. How prepared are the parties involved? What kinds of obstacles might they face? And are there opportunities ahead? I will introduce the panelists and say a few words about each one of them. I'll start with Ian London. Over the past 15 years, Ian has been actively engaged in the emerging advanced materials sector. Currently, as he calls in semi-retirement, he serves as executive director of C2M2A, an industry-led multi-stakeholder network that seeks and provides collaborative solutions to advance Canada's significant potential in the global critical materials supply market. He also chairs Canada's seat on the International Standards Organization's Rare Earth Technical Committee, serves as a committee member of the ISO TC 333 Lithium, co-chaired Canada's Rare Earth R&D Initiative from 2015 to 2021, and serves on the advisory board of the Rare Earth Industry Association. In 2012, Ian launched the now biennial Critical Materials Symposium series under the aegis of the Metallurgical Society of Canada. He's appeared before Canada's Natural Resource and Finance Parliamentary Committees on several occasions. Over his career, Ian has held executive position in the power sector and with engineered component supply chain organizations, and served on the boards of several clean technology companies. He holds a bachelor's in engineering, metallurgy from McGill and an MBA from Schulich School of Business. Greetings and thank you for being here, Ian. I will then move to introduce Konstantin Karagiannopoulos, a professional engineer who is the president and chief executive officer of Neo Performance Materials, a Canadian publicly listed company with the most globalized reach of rare earth supply chains and owner of the Western world's only operating industrial scale rare earth midstream facility. Most recently, Neo Performance Materials announced that it's developing a rare earths magnet hub in Estonia. I can't wait to hear more about this, which has gathered significant attention by major media, European and North American government, and automotive OEMs. He served as chairman, director, and executive in the rare earth, rare metal, and battery materials industries for 3 decades. Additionally, Konstantin is a member of the advisory board at the University of Toronto's Department of Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry, and also serves as a longtime director of the Canada-China Business Council. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in chemical engineering from the University of Toronto. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Roland Gauss. Roland is head of innovation and business intelligence at EIT Raw Materials. He received his PhD from the University of Tübingen in 2008. His research interests are related to metallurgy, the resource criticality and life cycles of materials and innovation. He worked in the fields of neodymium iron boron processing and recycling, the extractive metallurgy of copper, and geochemical fingerprinting. He was Marie Curie Research Fellow at University College London, head of department at Fraunhofer IWKS, and joined EIT Raw Materials as senior advisor in 2016. He led the raw materials group of the European Battery Alliance and coordinates the cluster rare earth magnets and motors of the European Raw Materials Alliance. So I'd like to pose the first question and ask each panelist to discuss Canada's and the EU's industrial policy ambition for critical raw materials. What are the expectations, and are we already seeing joint action? Let's start with Konstantin.
Thank you, Sophia. Graceful introduction. As you mentioned, you set the context quite well. With we are in a world that is transitioning from internal combustion to electrified drivetrains. In addition, energy efficiency is a massive trend, and on top of all of this, we have geopolitics, as you said, and all the supply chain problems that we've faced over the last couple of years as supply chains through globalization have become a lot more stretched. It took a mild sort of disturbance like a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal to just create massive dislocation. So I think the era of globalization may be coming into a contraction of globalization, and it might be reversing to some degree. And supply chains, driven by geopolitics as well as the needs of industrial players, supply chains will start becoming, and have already started, becoming shorter, much more localized, much more resilient. And this is, I believe, what drives the European agenda on supply chains and critical minerals. critical materials. I prefer to talk about materials as a materials guy. I'm not a mining guy. The criticality, I think, is much more specific on the materials processing of those minerals that come out of the ground. So clearly, Europe has done its homework, and they've learned from successful examples around the world, and they've developed a policy framework and a funding framework where they managed through a widely successful experiment around battery supply chains, and an outfit that Roland was a key part of, the Battery Alliance in Europe, to attract every major battery producer in the world into Europe to continue to help Europe with the automotive industry, rather, in Europe with its transition from internal combustion to electrification. I mean, Europe is a major player in automotive. You know, there isn't a single industrial economy in the world where automotive isn't a critical pillar of its development, and Europe is doing what it has to do in order to make sure that automotive is a big player and a big GDP contributor. So that now focus has shifted a little bit into drivetrains and therefore rare earths, because of rare earth magnets that go into the electric motors. I have to say that I've been saying to my government and in Canada and and all North American governments and other governments around the world that we all need to learn from successful examples. And Europe clearly is a very successful example. So what's driving this is the continuing development of automotive supply chains through supply chains that are resilient, they are circular, and they are robust. So the vertical integration of supply chains will provide some challenges for Europe, because mining is not exactly an easy thing to do in Europe. However, you know, at the end of the day, Europe is absolutely determined to localize and establish very, very secure supply chains. Canada, on the other hand, I mean, we come from a tradition of hewers of wood being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and then, you know, to some degree, we do some of the best work in that area. But I think, again, I hinted at where I'm coming from. The criticality of these materials comes a little further downstream. I mean, sure, you have to find them, sure, you have to dig them out of the ground, and you have to do that responsibly. But ultimately, you really need to have material science skills that allow these materials to end up in the devices where you want them to end up in. Canada has some fantastic universities, have some great startups in recycling, developing new processes. So I think Canada ultimately will also need to learn from what Europe is doing in order to enhance the functionality of its automotive industry through supply chains, and the automotive industry has been very, very good to Canada. So Canada needs to protect it and to enhance it. So Canada has a number of opportunities to play in, from the resource sector to the technology sector, all the way to recycling of critical raw materials, and eventually. Also, geopolitically, Canada needs to seriously look at diversifying its economy away from this one-way trade north-south, especially after some of the hiccups that appeared in that trading relationship through the previous administration and so on. So hopefully everybody's learning lessons, but I think Europe is creating a brilliant example of how things should get done.
So I hear, I'm going to pass the baton to Ian now to hear more about Canada, because what I hear is that Europe has kind of figured this out. They're a little bit ahead of the game. They have a clear ambition. Canada has potential. I'd like to tease that out a little bit more. What does Canada really want to achieve with this critical material in terms of the critical materials space? Because producing the automobiles or having a piece of the pie is something that is desirable, but there are many stages before we get to that, and the materials themselves are very important, and that's where everyone is feeling the heat. Let's put it this way. So tell us, Ian, what can Canada do? Europe has a plan. Roland is going to tell us more about it. But tell us more about Canada.
Well, I think Canada has an ambition. Thank you again for the kind introductions, and I applaud Constantine's comments and looking forward to this panel discussion. Canada has the elements, the pieces together, and I don't mean elements in terms of a chemical sense. It has a strong mining, it has a strong metallurgical history and experience. It has a depth in its universities. But traditionally it is looked at, or my sense is, as no integrated industrial strategy. And as we constantly use the term, supply chains, but even in this sector, it's, oh, let's get the raw material. There's a link, or a link here. Oh, here's metallurgical. There's a link. Here's the component business. Here's the end use. And we still visualize these things as individual links as opposed to a chain, where the Europeans seem to have started advancing it, and where our Asian friends have figured this out. You get to wonder sometimes, were they ever in the rare earth business, the Chinese, or were they in the, I'm going to build cars, washing machines, and I'm going to become the industrial nation, and put all these pieces together? North America, we still look at it in a almost a component perspective as opposed to a chain. Canada has that. We've demonstrated in the nickel industries, the aluminum sectors, the copper sectors. Hey, we built many of the telecom systems in the world, or at least the technology, haven't been able to pull it all together. So there are clearly lessons to be shared, learned, and partnered with our European colleagues and North American colleagues, because we will need a larger markets to do this. Canada has had this, as this hewers of wood, drawers of water mentality for many generations. If we look at what Canada recognizes, and the world's starting to recognize, if we look at it from an ESG perspective, we just can't ship raw materials. I don't want to be too bold, I'm not negative about the European Raw Material Alliance, but as Constantine alludes to, and I'm sure Roland will allude to, this is not about raw materials. This is about a supply chain. How do we advance technologies? How do we advance economies? How do we bring a net zero? And maybe we should be processing some of the materials here in Canada, or subcomponents here in Canada, or reshoring. Because as we found out, shipping components back and forth across the bridges to the US, it doesn't take much to bring it down. I do A, you do B, you send it back to me, I do C. One, I'm sure the carbon footprint is large, unless the truck is sitting in, well, even if the truck's sitting in Ottawa, they keep them running.
I love how the climate comes in, when conveniently.
Well,
conveniently. We did the whole globalization thing because it improved the bottom line. It made everything so much more efficient. And now,
right.
They shut down a bridge and we need to, reinvent the wheel. But
all governments have touted climate. I'm looking at it. You can tell by the gray hair. It's not for me. This is for my grandchildren. I promised them all that we were going to clean this stuff up in the 1960s and 70s. But from a North America or a Canadian perspective, the European, we have all the components. How do we bring them together? How do we bring in the academics, the industries, the governments? Lots of the discussion in government to government. These conversations have been going on for a long time. As we're talking back and forth, our competitors have built the chains. We have a long way to go to catch up, or to be self-sufficient, or when I say self, I don't mean Canada alone. I mean our own supply chain. So Canada has mining, metallurgical, academia, commercial, national labs. We've demonstrated we could do it, and always have risen to the occasion. This is a little more tricky because it's more highly technical. It is not millions of trucks going back and forth in terms of bulk. It's much more refined and subtle in terms of how do we bring some of these materials. It's also more than just automotive. Automotive's a cornerstone. We're having this conversation today around the world, and it's all done by computers and electronics and lenses and cameras, all critical material enhanced and all reducing climate. Pressures on climate, et cetera. So the components are there. The Europeans have a model which has worked. They've had government behind it. They may have to translate some things into 27 languages, with all due respect, not the perfect system. Having sat on a NATO panel for a number of years, sometimes the bureaucracy gets in the way. but the capacity and the capabilities are clearly there. It's getting on with the campaign.
So this is fantastic. This is fantastic news. Thank you, Ian. Okay, Roland, for the first time I'm hearing "Go Europe." This is wonderful because everybody judges Europe at, you know, that it's slow, that it can't get it together, that there's not one person in charge, except I always insist, and I've insisted in my scholarship as well, that, you know, Europe actually gets the job done without too much drama. And somehow it also manages to talk with everybody. So all the stakeholders. So while people are seeking businesses, Europe is talking to, you know, society, other politicians, businesses, different member states with all their different quirks and priorities. So it's learned how to do the negotiation. And I want to say that it seems from our previous speakers that they see that Europe has a plan and that there's backing, European backing for this plan. It's a great case study. So tell us about it. What is so great about it, and how can Canada and Europe work together to, you know, promote this ambitious strategic agreement?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question and the introduction. Well, first of all, there is this clear ambition to be climate neutral by 2050. It's clear that we're facing a major transition. And what has happened, let's say, over the last few years is that policy has been tailored around this, what they call a twin transition, a green transition and a digital transition. Yeah? And if you want to achieve that, and that has been recognized by political decision makers, you need to talk about supply chains. You need to make sure that you not only get the raw materials, but also the advanced materials, semi-finished products. We all heard about the semiconductor crisis. And you even need to think about how do you build up capacities to, once you have all this stuff piling up and used in different devices, how can you really push for a circular economy and build up capacity for not only recycling, but industrial symbiosis, companies working together and design for recycling and a greater awareness for the value you have with these not only components and products, but the raw materials in there. So that has been certainly recognized by decision makers in Brussels and the individual member states. And we have this, what we call the Green Deal, and this green and digital transition agenda. And let's say one key component of this policy certainly is this stakeholder engagement process. And if there's one thing you can learn and you know about raw materials, and particularly mining, it's that you need to have this engagement and socialized, operates, it's social acceptance of things that take place. So that's why we have this kind of particular, you call it experiment or new approach of these industrial alliances around some key, let's say, key technologies, key value chains. And the most successful case and widely recognized case really is the Battery Alliance, where you have a kind of a really strong outreach across the value chain. Really, you don't have only raw materials people talking to raw materials people or battery people talking to battery people, but really to facilitate the dialogue across the value chain. And this turned out to be kind of a role model for other key industrial sectors. So we have it in hydrogen, for instance. There's a Hydrogen Alliance connecting people. We have a European Raw Materials Alliance, where we focus really on various value chains. So this engagement and really to talk raw materials really to various stakeholders across the value chain, including those industries that actually produce products, the big OEMs, automakers, but also energy technology providers and equipment manufacturers. And that I think is so super important. And when we talk about critical raw materials, maybe one aspect needs to be mentioned, that you have this bigger policy on Green Deal and digital and green transition, but then you have also this critical materials or critical raw materials action plan, where they have kind of a very specific items and how to how to get this component or this perspective of raw materials into that policy. And these industrial alliances and the European Raw Materials Alliance is one key element of this critical raw materials action plan. There are other aspects like sustainable financing criteria for mining, R&D efforts, and so on and so forth.
So a couple of things. The first thing is that, you explained really well what Europe really brings to the table. They're very specific things, but also I'd like to underscore here that Europe is not decoupling from anybody. It's just recoupling with other partners.
Yeah.
So it's when they say we're diversifying,
Absolutely.
we're building new networks of interdependence, because I think that this is an important thing for the audience to understand. And that's perhaps part of the success.
Yeah, and I'd like to come in here because the key driver is a very important point you mentioned. The key driver is really that we believe in competition, right? And if you diversify supply chains, you increase competition. And innovation is the next key item. The innovation is a key driver, right? So to create level playing fields, to diversify, to agree on standards, on what is a sustainable raw material, how do we want this industry look like in the future? I think there's a lot of power to it. So actually diversification, the various suppliers will increase competition and innovation ultimately, yeah?
I mean, as a person who works on climate, I also want to say that it's very refreshing to hear that in, the refrain in every comment is also about making sure that the mining itself or the production of these materials also complies with this idea that we're moving toward a circular economy and that there's sustainability and standards of production in each and every step, because it does create, we often have this image that now we're going to have to mine the world for all of these materials, because what we're attempting right now is a massive overhaul of our industrial infrastructure. This is not for the faint-hearted. This is a huge change in the world economy and our industrial systems. Now, Konstantin, we talked a little bit about Europe, but you're sort of like a bridge, because you're listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange. It's a Canadian company, but you work, I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about Estonia. Estonia as one practical way that makes these kinds of strategic partnerships viable and possible. What are some of the opportunities and of the challenges? You need to put,
I was trying to keep a low profile. We have, as you pointed out earlier, the only industrial scale rare earth production facility in Europe, in Estonia. It has a history that goes back 100 years. It's gone through many transformations, but for the last 30 years, it has been producing rare earths and rare metals for aerospace and electronics. We consider it absolutely a strategic asset, not just for the company, but also for Europe. I have to tell you that over the last few months and quarters, I've had many conversations, both with Roland and his colleagues at the EU, but also with supply chain partners. We are under tremendous pressure by OEMs, as well as the tier one suppliers, to create the basis of producing those critical materials and components that these supply chains need in Europe. Where a lot of grand ideas fail, and where often government policies fail, is that you try to impose a new way of doing things from above. Ian and I and Roland, we've been talking about this. We've been talking about since we all had hair, and fundamentally, these value chains come together as a function of demand. if we know that we have customers for what we're going to be doing in Estonia, so we're going to invest our capital. The Estonian government and various EU programs will help with that cost of capital. But at the end of the day, we know that if we do this and if we do it right, we will sell our production, because our customers and their customers and their customers have told us that they're ready to buy from us, and we're having a number of conversations. In North America, that doesn't exist yet. And again, I spoke perhaps glowingly about what Europe is doing, but Europe has managed to bring together a government policy framework and the demand side of the equation in terms of the OEMs and their tier ones and all of their producers, and they're all moving in the same direction. This is critical. China has done it. Europe is doing it and has succeeded to a large degree. North America, and I tend to believe that North America is a couple of years behind Europe in all of this, simply because government and the private sector haven't come together to the same extent. So back to Estonia, so I don't want to be blabbering on.
Wait, before you tell us about this is a really interesting question, and then Ian's also going to chime in on this, but why not? They want to sell cars. They've committed to electrifying transportation.
Sure, but don't forget that it's the OEMs that make cars. It's
exactly. That's what I'm saying. Why haven't the OEMs? I think that in Europe, the OEMs have been very proactive. I mean, yes, the Commission, the European Union, let's say the government has been proactive, but I think that a lot of this was just fortuitous timing.
Yeah,
the OEMs were ready.
Yeah, I can only speculate. I mean, I can't get into people's minds, but don't forget the supply chains, the way they've been working for the last 2 decades. It's been great for the OEMs all over the world. It's been because not only have they had access to the largest and the fastest growing market in the world, which is China, where every single OEM makes more money in China than anywhere else in the world, but also China has been a manufacturing hub through long stretch supply chains, supplying assemblies in Europe and in the United States. So, for the last couple of decades, executives in the private sector, we've had it perhaps a little too easy. Like when you look at, you mentioned that, in addition to Estonia, we have plants in China. But when you look at what's going on in China, the vast majority of our customers are European, American, and Japanese manufacturers who set up shop in China. So it's a very integrated world. By the way, I'm not a big fan of reshoring or it'll take massive amounts of capital for no return of that capital that will be invested. So, but that's a different conversation. However, in North America, I guess there hasn't been the political or the government impetus to sort of force the OEMs and the consumer to start thinking differently. And clearly, this is where Europe has been successful. This is where China has had massive success. You can say what you want about China, but the Chinese consumer is buying EVs. It's the largest market for EVs in the world, and it's the largest production base for EVs in the world. So they've done something right, and we got to give them credit for that. So how do we translate those lessons to Europe and to North America? And it will take a new level of government private sector collaboration, which we haven't really seen in North America in a long time, where collaboration sort of ends at the point where here's $500 million, build a new, engine plant or a new car factory in my state or in my province, and we walk away from it.
So we'll talk a little bit more about the specific, because we will have, businesses are wondering what the opportunities, the challenges are, what they're going to be facing. So we'll talk about that as a little bit later in this conversation. But tell us a little bit about how Estonia is an example of how a collaboration or an enhancement of an existing infrastructure or an existing business can go to the next step of this puzzle. Because I think, as Ian said, instead of just looking at individual links, we really need to look at the chain. So how is Estonia forming a chain rather than just being one link?
Great question, Sophia. Estonia, in my experience, has been a great place to do business. Really driven, educated people. We have access to human capital that is extremely effective and efficient. A very supportive government. And when we look at the plant we have in Estonia, it's gone through many transformations over the last century. It started life as a refinery of shale oil from Estonia. After the Second World War, it became a uranium facility for the Soviet Union. And in the 70s, it became a rare earth and tantalum niobium producer. And now it's, again, just a rare earth and tantalum niobium producer at a much larger and much more sophisticated scale. So clearly we start with some critical materials that already are being produced in Estonia. So because our experience with that plant has been very, very positive, we were betting that we can transition again by continuing to expand its basic capabilities in rare earths. We can continue to expand and transition its skill set and capabilities into taking those rare earths, turning them into metals, alloys, and eventually magnets in Estonia to supply, first the tier 1 customers that we have in Europe, all the folks that are building components, electric motors and drivetrains and such. And this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's being pulled by the ultimate OEM and the ultimate consumer in Europe. And perhaps we can use that as a hub to supply North America or other jurisdictions, and perhaps even extend the lessons that we learned in Estonia to, say, North America at some point. But there's no question that Estonia has critical skills, critical capabilities, and hard assets. It has that infrastructure that makes it very easy for private capital to invest, to incrementally expand its capabilities without really taking a massive bet, starting something from scratch with all the unknowns around it. So, it's as I said earlier, we consider it an extremely strategic asset, both for ourselves, but also for the European supply chains.
So Ian, I'd like to take it to you now. On the one hand, we've heard Europe has very specific things to offer. We saw a specific example of an asset or infrastructure that exists within the European Union, even though it changed. It has a long history of changing hands and borders, maybe, and also materials. But it is a strategic asset right now for the European Union, and it can be upgraded or its productivity can be enhanced to form part of this chain. What specifically would the European Union hope to gain from this strategic partnership? Because it's not just a loose relationship, it's a strategic partnership. What exactly would Canada bring to the table in practice?
Yeah.
Does it have the materials?
Yeah.
Does it have
yes, it
energy?
does.
What does it have?
Yeah, it actually has many of the elements you're talking about. I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on, if I may, just before I get to that, is a comment that Constantine made, because he and I, we all chat about demand pull, very important. But as Constantine was alluding to, is how do we lever Estonia to the end customer? What's also important about this link, and he's had discussions, how do I feed his plants? Because he needs feedstock in any sort of an expansion plant. And where does it come from? It's come from Canada, it can come from anywhere, and I won't get into specifics, but that whole supply chain has a raw material side. What does Canada have? Well, first of all, we always talk about mining as a hard rock mining capability or capacity, which means break new grounds in strange and wondrous worlds. Great. We also have tailings ponds. We also have auxiliary or secondary sources coming out of the oil sand project, the oil industries, et cetera, which have some of the critical materials in it. I'm not going to judge which ones are not right now, because there's always a great debate as, are the concentrations there or not. But if I have a tailings pond, I'm just using that as an example, which is rich in materials which 20 years ago when it was set up, nobody cared about, just dump it in the pond. Why don't we reopen them? It's already out of the ground, already crushed, ground, and floated. Can those be reprocessed and used as feedstocks? May have to work with facilities such as Constantine runs. So how do we adjust the specifications on both the feed supplier and the downstream processor? It has the metallurgical capabilities. It also has end-use markets close to the U.S. We always poo-poo saying, the U.S. partners, and I'm not downplaying Europe. Big consumers down in the U.S. Canada has been feeding that country in trade. As he mentioned, you close down a bridge for a couple of weeks. Wait a minute, it shuts down. And many of those users are just-in-time suppliers, or need just-in-time producers of components and or elements. That's access to markets. So we have a metallurgical capability, large petrochemical and chemical industries in this country. So a talent pool is there, needs to be redirected or more focused on critical materials. So yes, we have resources, secondary. We do have inexpensive power and clean power. One of the big opportunities in Canada is on lightweighted materials. One of those materials will be scandium or lightweighted aluminum scandium alloys. Where's the aluminum industry? Around James Bay, cleanest hydropower in the world. And if we're looking at a carbon footprint, or however we wish to measure it, there's a strategic advantage and of interest to Europe. Because at the end of the day, ultimately the end consumer will say, give me the total carbon footprint. Yes, I'm very clean on this process. Oh, I'm very clean on this process. And wait a minute, the lead is very dirty, and in aggregate, it doesn't add up. So Canada has secondary sources. It has a long-term mining. We were the nickels producers of the world and all of that. So it has inexpensive power. It has a value system. It's a reliable partner, and it has national commercial labs to move the thing forward. We may have to integrate those changes, Roland reiterated, of the front end or the upstream to feed plants such as what Constantine's building to feed a European market. Can some of that, I'm not going to get into reshoring or secondary operations, but can some of those links be replicated here so we don't have to have boatloads of material getting stuck in, across the ocean or stuck at ports, which only hurts economies, is less reliable, and ain't too good for an environmental footprint. So what Canada brings, it has a resource capability. It's not all hard rock, brand new mining. It has an industrial base to do it. It has customers in North America, in terms of, yes, there's 300 million or 500 million Europeans. Well, North American markets, if you tie in Mexico, et cetera, 400, 500 million people. Not a bad market. And the Europeans can play an instrumental role in streamlining those supply chains, lower the cost, and a lower branded material of, yes, it's clean out of Europe, clean out of Canada. I'm not sure what's coming out of the US or their value system, but eventually I think it will become it'll become the standard. Hence, Canada has played a role on the ISO, actually setting up technical standards on sustainable. Canada actually drafted traceability and sustainability standards on the rare earth sector globally, which have now been accepted by the Japanese and the Korean. So Canada has that capability. Yes, we're a small country, but Nortel and Bell Canada pulled off all kinds of technologies and the aerospace industries. We have actually automotive, so lots of components we bring. Now, industry-led, I think it's fundamental. Industry pulls it together, and Canada has tended to look at, like I mentioned before, the individual links or components, but not integrating them. And we tend to historically start it off upstream to work downstream. As Constantine mentioned, that equation has to be turned around in demand. If you want more electric vehicles, the Europeans have incented it. Yes, the automotive sector in Europe has moved forward and galloped on electric vehicles because the opportunities in Asia and in Europe. They also raised the environmental standards, the exhaust standards on vehicles. Wait a minute.
Well, especially
you stimulated
after the
demand.
scandal.
Sorry? Except for the vehicle scandal. No, I
No,
understand.
I'm just saying, especially after the diesel scandal, I think it became very important for Europeans to, how would I say, green transportation, because
The green transportation, correct. And now North America, in Canada, it's a more complex issue because it's just the geography of the country.
So I have a question, since we're on this topic now, and it seems as if, I mean, and of course, you know, Canada is very close to the United States. It has that geographic proximity, and there's a friendly relation, and there's always been trade and exchange. And okay, even best friends disagree at times. And so it's always good to have other friends as well. But has there been any kind of, I don't know, any kind of talk about this important agreement that the EU and Canada and the EU have signed? Has there been any feedback from the United States? Is it something that is actually going to help bring the US also on board more quickly? Or is it going to form a triangle? Or is it going to first mature as a bilateral, let's say, agreement? Ian?
Is that to me? Okay. Ooh, that's actually an interesting question. Now, which of my friends in global affairs am I going to offend? No.
Okay, well,
you know, they
do your best to be neutral.
We have tended, in my view, as a citizen, the sense I get is it tends to be bilateral arrangements. I think they will evolve to be global. We're competing against nations of, you know, Asia, which are what, 2 billion people? In North America and Europe, maybe we'll get close to 1 billion. Like, they eventually, I think, they ultimately will have to integrate them, and especially if you have, or make it more triangular, as opposed to individual prongs. So I think that's eventual. Has the European trade agreement gotten attention? Yes. But I also know they're complicated because you have rare earths, but you also have dairy, and you have many other prongs which make these processes complex, and I don't even understand them. I don't know how anybody does. They are complex in terms of the multi-trade arrangements. I have not necessarily seen, I know there is a trilateral meeting between Japan and the EU and the US. Canada and Australia are now part of it. More from a technical exchange as opposed to an industrial strategy.
What was the tripartite? You mean what
tripartite? Yeah.
Be the tripartite post 2010 rare earth crisis has now expanded into more of an exchange.
It's more of an exchange, but it's still not an industrial strategy as we're talking about today, what is needed. And the governments all have to, you know, our American friends have taken bold actions, at least on paper, in terms of funding, support, et cetera. Our Europeans have not only put funding, but actually brought industry and all that. Canada is aspiring to do that. And industry is working with our government friends to accelerate that and move it forward, because the capabilities there and our reputation. You know, all these projects are, you know, we listen to all these projects being financed. Most of mining and metallurgical projects are financed here out of Canada through the exchanges. There's the finance sector. All these prospectors or processors, you know, Toronto or Canada, it tends to finance them, or at least be the base to finance them. So
okay, Roland. Roland, what about Europe? Why does Europe want to work with Canada so badly? And how's that going?
No, I think the development, the trend is obvious, as I indicated before. They are bold and very strong ambitions, right? I remember our former German Minister for Economy, Peter Altmaier, said by 2030, we want to produce 30% of all the battery cells worldwide. 30%, basically a ramp up from zero, almost zero, to 30% in an emerging market. So it's everything is growing. So if you know a little bit about raw materials, geology, and math, you know what it's enormous amounts. So there's a massive demand, and although people, anticipate and understand, okay, there is a demand, to really understand what it really means in terms of supply chains is on a different level. So people on those companies producing these products, they realize now they need to diversify, they need to find alternatives. We have it for the batteries. We also have it for the wind turbine energy, clean wind energy. There are very, very ambitious goals for setting up wind turbines, particularly offshore. Many of them run with so-called direct drives, with heavy. Many of them contain large amounts of permanent magnets. So, if you really want to have clean energy, you need to have clean materials in those energy technologies. So the demand is absolutely there, and that's why the strategy is really threefold. It's really yes, promote some domestic sourcing, promote some domestic mining, maybe even promote circular economy, but at the same time also to develop strategic partnerships with like-minded nations, with countries that have a shared value system when it comes to environmental, social, and governance standards that has the potential to grow. And that's why there is this strong
Roland, if I may, Sophie, I just want to add one comment. We have forecasted demand, but commercially, and talking about investment, etc., a number of these corporations actually need contracts to finance them, or a certain degree commitments to move it forward.
Absolutely.
And that seems to be, tremendous growth potential. But if you look at an investment, Constantine, allow him to comment, and I apologize if I'm stirring the pot a little bit, he needs an order or something
Absolutely.
a little more concrete to go back to his bankers or his shareholders to invest in it. Otherwise, it's an academic economics
Absolutely.
planning strategy. Sorry.
Oh, don't call academics right now. In the sense
I apologize to you also.
that we don't use facts and
No,
we use fiction and we're wishful thinking. We do.
No, that's why I hear you.
Data-driven, empirical research. I know, I can see, first of all, because I know the people on this panel, I know that Constantine is thinking, of course, because if somebody just announces a target without really studying what it takes to reach this target, we're going to run into these obstacles, if not, problems. And I kind of want to segue with this because this conversation is so interesting, but of course, we want to also hear from the audience, and please put in your questions in the Q&A box. I just wanted to talk about businesses now are facing, they may be asking different kinds of questions. For example, we're seeing that we forecasted demand. We want to know, we want to hear the nitty gritty about financing in order for companies to make these kinds of commitments. And I'll go to Constantine in a minute, but there's also, lessons to be learned. What has China done well? What is it that we can tell businesses? Because there are many people here who are also, in the business community, and they are the ones who will be doing all of what it takes to make this transition. And again, I will say that there is a very short window. I mean, we were talking about 2030. I don't want to call it D-Day, but it's a very important key date. That if we don't have our act together by then, the reason why we're decarbonizing, digitalizing is a little bit different, but we're decarbonizing because of the climate crisis. So, Constantine, prices are going up for these materials. We hear a lot of talk. How urgent is it to have, to actually do the math and get commitments, and who is supposed to be committing?
Well, that's a huge question, Sophia. First of all, I share the views of some very close colleagues who run major companies, and in our conversation, we all come to the same conclusion that if we're going to do this, if we're going to decarbonize, the challenge is immense. Therefore, the solution needs to be sort of a Manhattan Project type solution where government, private sector, academia, multilateralism, it all comes together. Otherwise, I really think that we may not meet the targets that we have set for what we need to do within the time frame that scientists tell us that we have. So there's no question that if we're going to transition our energy habits and profiles, we will need a massive investment in resource processing. And I'm not talking about mining. Yes, we need to mine more. There's no question. If you're going to build 100 million vehicles with batteries, we don't make enough lithium, cobalt, nickel, anything, any of the materials that need to go in there. So if we want to decarbonize, we need to use more materials. But there's no silver bullet. We need more mining. We need more recycling. We need more and more efficient processing. We need to reduce our consumption and reduce our footprint. But there isn't a single solution that will get us there. We need to do all of the above, and we need to do them better. This is where ESG comes in. And in my view, it's absolutely critical. And for companies like ours, as well as companies throughout our supply chains, ESG is going to be one of the major trends over the next decade, 2 decades, and so on. It will be the normal way of doing business. Eventually, we'll stop talking about it because it will go without saying. So, excuse me, what again, I'm focusing on the European example. We saw President Biden come up with the Build Back Better and all these pronouncements to invest billions, if not trillions, into doing things differently. And the dysfunctionality in the political system, both in the United States and in Canada, has prevented the government from doing what it needs to do. At the same time, you look at Europe, and as you said, for years, Europe had a reputation of being difficult to make decisions, but they pulled it off. They got the policy framework, and they got government, and they got industry to buy in and consumers to buy in. So if you can pull that off, you got everybody going in the same direction, then all kinds of really solid things, good things can happen. Now, Europe has a number of programs, whether it's the IPC, the Important Project of Common European Interest system that has funded the battery establishment in Northern Europe, whether it's the Innovation Fund or the Just Transition Fund. Europe ultimately has managed to put money on the table, which ultimately is one of the components that you'll need to be good with. So I keep telling, as I said, my government, look at all the successful examples. Look at, there's an industrial strategy that, in previous liberal laissez-faire economic terms, industrial strategy was a 4-letter word. Well, guess what? China has had pretty good success with industrial strategies. Europe is proving that you need an industrial strategy to create the buy-in and create the conditions for the private sector to put capital at risk and do the right thing. So, I'm talking around in circles here, and I think we need to come up with better ways of doing things. I think that, without being too critical of my neighbors to the south, the previous 4 years have done a lot of damage to multilateralism and the relationships between states that need to improve if we're going to tackle major global problems. Perhaps I'm sounding Pollyannish, but without working at a different level among states, among private public sectors, where we're not going to get to 2030 or to 2040 or 2050 in a way that leaves a lot of hope for the future.
So I want to tap into a couple of the questions that I see here. One person is asking how to mitigate the risk of supply chain management in the presence of the present pandemic crisis and the optimistic outlook. I'm not entirely sure about the second half of the question, but what can we do about the supply chains right now? I mean, we did talk about the pandemic, the Suez Canal, and geopolitics are all impacting supply chains. They're also driving the prices of materials. What are our thoughts on that? I mean, is all that going to, I mean, we know that these kinds of strategic partnerships can help, as we said, build new supply chains, build complementary supply chains, diversify the supply chains, make them more resilient. But there is a crisis right now. And it seems like the supply chains all supply chains are now being affected. So what are some of your thoughts about these larger supply chain disruptions as we're trying to create new options? And how will the fact that we've embarked on this huge plan and the influence that it's had on the prices of materials, how will that affect, you know, the road to decarbonization? I guess Roland, maybe, and then Ian.
Yeah, I mean, the first key point is really, you mentioned yourself a couple of times now, this issue of diversification. Each time you have a high production concentration in regionally, politically, or even company-wise, your supply chains are simply not resilient. Yeah? So, and this is not only about rare earth. You can look into niobium, for instance, or other metal supply chains. As soon as you have a high production concentration, your system is simply not resilient. So we need to strategically invest. And when I say we, really from the policy side, but also from industry, yeah, and make this extra efforts to see the value also of having those options, of those alternative options, and not just to get misled by daily spot prices of what, you know, where can I get this cheapest in the next few days, but to have this kind of value, to have options to choose from, and to have a more resilient supply chain. And things that certainly go hand in hand with this is to increase transparency. I mean, it's amazing that we do not even know today very often where our, you know, where the cobalt in my phone in the battery is coming from, or yeah, where the individual metals and all these applications we have is really coming from. Yeah? So what is the footprint of the material in your product from your supplier? It's not easy to say. Yeah? So increased transparency, and then of course we talked also before to identify, you know, what is actually, to have a debate, what is actually sustainable material? Yeah? What does it make to have a sustainable material? And here we need to talk about standards. We mentioned that before, and the major topic all around is of course awareness, right? So awareness at all levels. This is also a key aspect that we promote at EIT Raw Materials, to, you know, create awareness at various levels of society, even at schools, you know, and talk to the younger generation about the importance of this subject matter.
So standards and ESG, I mean, it keeps coming back. I'd like to know, I mean, Europe for sure, and Canada, I would also say for sure, big, great standard writers, except, and there's power in setting the standards. Who writes the book of standards writes the book of standards, of global standards. Now, how does that impact the developing world, where so many of these mines or not materials, minerals, I would say, are coming from? I mean, what are our thoughts on that, Ian?
A couple of thoughts on that, and then just coming back to what are some of the things to do Canada can do and others. And I'll do that first. Streamline permitting, and you know, rather than closing up tailings ponds, could these be opened? Collaborative efforts in engineering. The free market is not going to come back. And one of the approaches we have taken in North America is we'll let the competitive market determine which projects are going to succeed, not succeed. That's not what we're competing against. We're competing against nations who sit there and say, yeah, we're high risk. This one's going to work. That one's not going to work. And that's where I want to direct our talent pools to make them work. Ooh, you may have to underwrite some of the expenses, be it guarantees and or some offtake agreements. I'm not suggesting these are bailouts. but we have to drive this process. I think mission, if this was a war on the border, it's amazing how fast this stuff would be put together. Wake up. This is Manhattan Project. You want to do this? Let's get it done, which means bold decisions with mistakes, etc. The standard side is driven by, again, the demand side. We actually, on the ISO rare earth and on the system, Canada actually, with the Australians, Canada actually did the white paper, drafted the transparency standards on the front end of mining for rare earths. It was eventually adopted by, or taken, we did a with the Australians championed it through, and it's now been accepted by the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. You're right. We've now got to get the industry to sit there and say the same thing as we did with, ISO 9000 and 14,000, et cetera. The customer demands it, or you don't get it. It's not going to happen just because there's a book of standards. That's not going to happen. And this is not going to necessarily happen quickly. But can we reinforce those things to accelerate it?
I want to point there that Europe again here has an advantage, because the truth is that the European population, based on the Eurobarometer polls, there seems to be a consensus that, we really want standards, clean standards. We want green standards. We want sustainable standards to be part of this value of the supply chain.
Yep.
So, and is public opinion as, how would I say, do they have as much buy-in on the Canadian side?
Good question, but we're actually at both tables. Actually, our European friends have been a little slow at the ISO standards. They have their own organizations, etc. So the Denmark, UK has just joined, not the EU any longer, but the Germany's watched and we're not necessarily as active because it is a complex, painful process. Because there's a global consensus basis approach. But that's the way we're going to implement it. If we're going to get some of these ISO standards or whatever the standards are, you got to be at the table. And since our competitors are buying up many of these other resources, we've got to influence them. Does Canada enjoy? Well, I'm not sure. I think we support the standards. I'm not sure many Canadians even understand that we have standards for everything. I think they're always amazed that you can take a plug and plug it into any socket in the world and it works. How did that happen? Not by magic.
Yeah.
So standards are a very important part of the equation. Constantine, you wanted to say something, and then I'd like to refer to a couple of the questions that I see here.
Sure. A couple of things. The earlier question on supply chain and supply chain resiliency, you have to diversify supply chains. There's no question. I mean, our plant in Estonia, for example, we've been on this drive for a while. Our plant in Estonia has traditionally been supplied by raw materials that come from Russia. They've been supplying us for 30, 40 years, have done a great job, but they're limited. They can't produce anymore. So as we're trying to expand, we put another measure in place with a deal we did with an American company, Energy Fuels. They take a waste material. Ian was talking about tailings. They take a byproduct from an existing mining operation in Georgia in the US. They bring it into their plant in Utah. They extract the rare earths, and they send the feed material to our plant in Estonia. Sure, it goes over an ocean and it's long supply chains and so on, but you start with something that was a waste. So this, and I'm having conversation with all kinds of junior miners and developers of assets, rare earth assets, and tantalum niobium assets in North America, in Canada, in South America, in Australia. And I made it very clear to them, we will buy from you once you're ready to start producing, but at the same time, based on what our customers are telling us, I'm telling my potential suppliers, do not even think of going into production unless you have a robust environmental, social, and governance system in place, simply because I've been put through the ringer by all of our customers who are crawling all over our plants, auditing us. So it's not just a standards issue. My customers, the folks that pay our bills, they demand it because their customers demand it and their customers demand it. So at any given time, I have 3, 4 tier ones crawling all over our plants, whether it's in China, in Estonia, or in Thailand, or in Germany, or in Canada, for example, and they're going through their audit, the ESG audit for all of them. So ESG is no longer a throwaway term just to make us all feel good. It's costing money, but a lot of effort is going into it, and the customers, the tier ones, the Siemenses and the Daimlers and the Volkswagens of this world demand it. So if you're going to be doing business with the big consumers, you better learn how to play the game according to their expectations. No ifs, ands, or buts. We can complain, we can whine, we can say we need higher prices and so on. But at the end of the day, this becomes a very, environmental, social, and governance behavior becomes a minimum entry into the club of doing business. So if you're not prepared to do that, don't even bother developing a mine and wherever it might, that mine might be. So, companies that are developing assets have a choice to make, and that choice to me is obvious because we're spending a lot of time, effort, and resources on ESG across the company. But for others, it's something that they need to get up to speed very quickly if they're going to participate in these supply chains in the near term.
So I want to go to these 2 questions now. One question is very specific. Where do you see supply chain opportunities between Canada and Eastern Europe, and specifically Bulgaria? And can possible areas, and are there areas where China can provide expertise? So when we say EU, it's, 27 member states. What are there regional components to this strategy? Are there more eager partners? How would you respond, Roland, to this kind of, or Ian, or Constantine?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's Europe. It's actually various countries, various stakeholders. It's a complex setup. There's certainly individual member states having certain maybe focus areas and so forth, but it would be difficult now to single out a particular country. Yeah, so there is industrial or industry in various countries. There's particularly in Eastern Europe also a strongly growing battery industry. Yeah. With not only European players, but also Korean and Chinese investors coming over. In the north, we have the most famous startup, if you want to call it like this, is Northvolt's investing in the battery value chain. With the rare earth, it's a little bit more, let's say, we have a small, but still we have a footprint in Europe, of course in Estonia, but also in Germany. We have magnets manufacturing in France. So there are various opportunities, various ways you can connect potential Canadian supply chains to the European, let's say, complex industrial landscape. Yeah. So I wouldn't single out a particular country. It's just diverse, and it's with the different history. Yeah?
Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, one of the things that I found very interesting about the EBA specifically was that member states were also, I mean, they were using European funds, but also there was national funding and buy-in in order to get a piece of the pie. And I always use Greece as an example because this is not a country in which, it's not a country that has this kind of industry, and yet it has very strong engineers, a lot of technology knowledge, and it's contributing to this project. And it is participating in the EBA. So in other words, what I've always found very hopeful about what Europe is doing is that it's also it's giving all member states opportunities to get some piece of the pie of this transition, not just, as I would say, sorry for Germany, the usual suspects. We know who the big industrial countries are in Europe, right? Germany.
Absolutely. So and you need to, part of the complexity, it has there's a good side to it, but also a challenging side is that there is a complexity also in the different funding systems we have, right? So there's EU funding on the EU level, and then there's member states funding, and there's even within the countries regional funding. And in the case that you just mentioned, these important projects of common European interest is really, it's actually member states' money, right? But governed on an EU level. So countries really working together and using specific national money to really promote industry and development, but then also backing it up more with EU money, so different funds. So the different funds really play together. And one key aspect is really, and that's kind of a quote, to not leave someone behind in this green transition. To really strategically invest in regions, for instance, of where we today have coal mining, right? So can we use those industrial areas that might might not have so a bright future with the existing industries? So absolutely.
So there's a question which I'm going to read as is, and then I'll think, well, you can interpret what you understand for it, but somebody may want to discuss it a little bit. What are the policies of the Canadian government or companies to export technologies and the know-how that enable European states to extract and control locally the raw materials needed to meet that market demand? Who would like to?
Maybe just to mention this context, that there is within this raw materials collaboration, it's not only about linking up businesses. It has a dedicated pillar on linking researchers and scientists. So there's an exchange program definitely taking place. So you have this kind of business column, this business interaction, R&D efforts and exchange, and this ESG level. Maybe just as a feedback on this question.
And there's another question which I think is also interesting about how do we manage the supply chain management in the biggest Africa free trade zone, which has 54 countries, from a Canadian perspective. What about the free trade zone of Africa? Ian?
I have to defer to others on that one. There are Canadian companies actually operating there, and so for decades. I'm not sure we're acquiring all the resources that our Asian friends have done in the last while. So, but I'm not sure I have an answer to the question or how I could respond to that question.
Yes, it is a little bit of a. I'm not sure I entirely understand the actual ask of the question, but
I think there's some relationship between this question and the earlier question about smaller member states such as Bulgaria and what Canada could do. Canada, first of all, to repeat something that Ian said earlier, half or more than half of the world's capital that is raised to go into natural resources is raised right here in Toronto, right here. This is where I am. So right here means here on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So this is very powerful. I think there's so many projects around the world that Canadian companies have started or have collaborated with. The capital is raised in Canada and then it's invested in the States. So clearly Canada is a leader in that area, and it will continue to be a leader as long as regulations continue to evolve in accordance to the growing capabilities and needs of this market. Then you have a lot of good technologies coming out of Canada, environmentally sensitive technologies, green technologies, recycling technology. So all of those could be implemented into the right project anywhere in the world. And unless we're talking about really, really sensitive stuff, I don't believe there's any prohibition on the export of technology to go into projects of common good. So again, in Canada, it would start at the capital raise. I think one of the biggest, greatest assets that Canada has is its ability to, because as Canadians, we understand natural resources. We have also a tremendous ability to raise capital to invest into natural resource projects. And then if you couple, again, at the risk of repeating myself, if you couple that with all the ESG work that's going on, I think there is a way to go forward where there is much more responsible extraction and also much more circular development of resources. And I think it all goes hand in hand, because simply if we continue to do what we've done in the past, things don't work. I mean, the model of development of capital going into Africa, whether it was European capital or American capital or Canadian capital or Chinese capital, it has always left something to be desired. It really has done a lot of harm in addition to all the good that it's done. Right. So we need to correct all the mistakes that we can historically see in investing in natural resources like in Africa and in the smaller member states. Finally, what I would say about Europe and what Europe is doing, Europe, again, there's been an awful lot of thinking by a lot of really bright people that has gone into how do we do this in Europe. So there's the IPCEI framework that we mentioned, but the IPCEI is a tool that can be utilized by richer states with larger budgets, and it kind of leaves the smaller states aside. So then you have the Just Transition Fund, which is a great way to promote the transition into green technologies and decarbonization. And that is a lot more egalitarian because it goes into all the small countries as well. And then, there's such a thing as the Innovation Fund that's so far targeted towards wind energy generation, but it could perhaps be tweaked to include energy efficiency and other projects. So all of that suggests to me that Europe has gotten the big pieces right. There is a little bit of tweaking just in some of the programs to ensure that pan-European problems will take pan-European solutions. And then you will need perhaps a larger degree of collaboration among the big economic states and the smaller states. But I've been very impressed with how Europe has pulled it off, and I wish North America would learn from it and start implementing very similar programs to promote energy transition.
Sophia, can I add one comment? Because it's interesting when we're talking about technology transfers and all of that. But during this conversation today, we're talking about bold moves, a closing window of opportunity, et cetera. Maybe and a broader vision of a cleaner environment and a transition to the new economies. To what extent do we have to become bolder on and be less concerned with talking about IT transfer, IP transfers, or the utilization of it for the common good? Now that's a bold initiative, but we spent this goes back decades. I've been involved in conversation about, I'm going to protect this technology or this IP and all that. Meanwhile, we're not moving the goal, what's the football term? The goalposts or the line measures forward. We're kind of stuck on the finer points. You're right. Some technologies could be taken advantage of and all that. We got to put it into production if we're going to build the supply chains, or the opportunity won't be there. The other thing is, in some of this technology advancement, we have to take a view of we have to think about the next generation of technologies that we can compete with or grab, because our incremental move along this is we're finally going to build batteries to the old technologies. Wait a minute, by the time we get all our lithium and cobalt and graphite all put together, we'll be on solid state, which may not even use these materials. There's a bold initiative if we're going to take on this Manhattan type project approach on a broader collaborative level. Maybe a little too bold for this conversation, but
food for thought. We need to move forward. We need to move the conversation forward. So before I thank everybody, I just wanted to also add, in terms of the question about Africa. I mean, Europe has the Global Gateway project, where, I mean, Europe has never really left Africa, and it's been there in many ways, shapes, and forms, and the relationships, the partnerships have continued to really to grow and reach a level, let's say, of maturity where the relationship is becoming a true partnership. And I think that now there's an understanding that, you know, this transition cannot only be in the purview of the old OECD countries, but that both the production of these new technologies, the development, the innovation, the knowledge sharing for the creation of these new technologies also have to involve the developing world. And for Europe, Africa, I mean, the geography alone and also the relations signal that, you know, there's going to be a lot of collaboration, I think, in the future, intensified collaboration based on, you know, things that have already been happening. So I do think that we're going to see a lot of movement there, especially moving forward, because again, it's a planetary transition. It's not a regional transition. So I want to thank everybody because I know we're running out of time. I don't know if Delphine wants to come back on. I want to thank everyone for being here and for this wonderful conversation. I guess we gave everyone food for thought. We too are kind of thinking through these different issues. Time is of the essence. I take as, I guess the takeaway is that this strategic partnership between Canada and the European Union is welcome. It adds value to this transition. It also fortifies a relationship that has always been there, a positive relationship. And, you know, we all, I assume, look forward to the exchanges and to the deepening of this relationship and to the practical implementation of the next steps. So thank you for having us, Delphine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia. I think it's a very good conclusion indeed. It has been a very intense and very interesting conversation, and I think there's so much more to say, so much more to do, of course, between the EU and Canada, but as you said, also it's a worldwide issue. So, but again, EU and Canada being like-minded partner, I really believe, and I think this is the essence also of this partnership, that more can be done. So obviously it's a topic that will continue to work on for sure. So to our participants today, if you are really interested in following this topic, but also others between EU and Canada, feel free to sign up to our newsletter on our website directly, ucan.com. And of course, before I kind of turn off this webinar, I really wanted to thank all our panelists and Sophia for moderating this event. This has been a very tremendous event, a lot of very good information. And again, we are going to write reports and continue to work on this. So again, really thank you to the four of you. That it has been really great. And yeah, the last information that I wanted to mention is that our next event is on April 13, which is the EU-Canada Business Day, Green Back Better, that will leverage opportunities of the net zero transition in Europe and Canada. So it's also a way of continuing this conversation. So feel free to check our website to check the information, and again, sign up to our newsletter to receive all the latest information. Again, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening for those in Europe or other part of the world. Have a wonderful day for those connecting from North America, and see you very soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Be well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.